This is called questioning the brilliance. The flickering bulb, once luminescent, now burnt. The curtains of the stage, once vibrant, now moth-eaten. She swanned from one alcove to the next, the heavy bustle of her dress swirling the dust. Her hands clasped and fluttered her fan, which faintly sparkled in the dying house lights.
It's perfect,
she demurred to her husband. He looked on at the derelict stage with barely concealed disgust, his gaze not meeting hers. It's a perfect waste of money.
Oh, darling, how could you?
She fanned her arms out dramatically and took center stage.
It's where we met, after all.
Of course, how could I? If possible, he became even more bored and turned to the owner. Doesn't seem worth the asking price. The owner, an older fellow, nervously twisted his hands and kept looking towards the madam. Well, sir, it's a treasure. How about we retire to your office and talk about a more reasonable price for this so-called treasure? The old man tried to protest, but he was manhandled quickly off the stage. What about the madam? Faintly he asked, as he tried to crane his neck and look back. What about her? She's fine where she's at. For it was true, the woman had not moved. Her arms still held out beside her, dark gloves soaking up the feeble stage lights, like an ivy's leaves soaking up the sun. Her body bending and curling, as if in a dream she glided from one position to the next. She raised a leg, joining her arms above her head, stretching her fingers out as far as they can go. She could see the metal grid of the catwalk above her. She reached even further still, but a sharp pain tore through her spine. The madam fell to the dirt-covered ground with a wordless cry. The world swarmed before her. The audienceless seats looked on at her miserable performance. No one to witness how she glowed, how brightly she burned before the crushing grip of pain grounded her back into reality. She curled into a fetal shape, tenderly bringing her knees to her chest before smothering herself into the folds of her dress and letting out a bleating sob. She rested a while there, undisturbed except the motes which resettled on her useless body. She allowed herself to fade briefly into unconsciousness, just a small nap, until the pain faded or her husband returned. Lucy! A bright voice yelled directly into her ear. The madam sprung awake, her pulse racing.
Who on earth?
She started, but shock cut her off, for standing in front of her was
Maddie?
Who else? You're lucky I caught you before the mistress came in. You know better than to practice on the main stage. The girl placed small hands on her tiny waist, clothed in a nondescript gray dancer's uniform. Lucy could do nothing in reply but stare in shock. Come on now, let's get you up before the mistress comes barreling. Comes what? A sharp voice cracked through the empty theater. Lucy's head whipped fast, her shock and grief mounting. A barrel, Matilda? Really? From the shadows of the audience, the main stage emerged, pale arms glowing against the darkness, from where she appeared. It's just a figure of speech, mistress, Maddie murmured, kicking her feet back and forth. Ah, yes, of course. And Lucinda once again dancing center stage after hours. How many times must I correct this behavior? Lucy said nothing, caught between two ghosts. Well, if you are so determined to break my rules, go on then. Maddie gasped, looking between the mistress and Lucy. Mistress, surely you— Quiet, Maddie. This is not a matter that concerns you. Well, Lucinda, are you to move sometime today? She prowled down the aisle and stalked up the steps. Her tall figure loomed over Lucy's crumpled form.
No, mistress, I cannot see you.
Now that you have an audience, suddenly your feet have turned to blocks of ice.
No.
Or is it that I am not allowed to see you dance so splendidly? You do not follow my rules. How foolish of me to think I am a worthy audience of your talent. Her anger burned bright, a hand like a hot iron landing itself on Lucy's shoulder. And Lucy refused to speak, emotions burbling inside of her. The mistress read her silence as contempt. I see. Matilda, leave the stage at once. Maddie, knowing she had expired all of the mistress's goodwill, hurriedly scampered away. Lucy imagined she heard a faint sorry buried in the susurrus of the curtains. The mistress regarded Lucy, sliding her hand from her shoulder to breast then hip. If you will not dance for me, then you will dance with me. The warmth of the older woman's hand on her waist was electric. and sending out fissures along Lucy's nerves. Long fingers gripped her, while the wideness of a palm cradled her hip. Lucy had only a moment to savor the bizarre feeling of being ensnared and treasured before she was swept up into rapid motion. Together they flew through the main dance, the mistress taking place of the male lead, and Lucy had no choice but to comply or be trampled by the older woman's powerful limbs. Their bodies burned together, and the places where flesh touched flesh seared. Fear soon became consumed by excitement, and she was spun out, then pulled forcibly back into an embrace. A dip, then the soft impact of their chests, swirls and colors, the lift and flutter of a skirt. She was brought up on point in a daze, her body so effortlessly controlled by the mistress. With one final flourish, her body was brought back to softly collide with the other, breasts pushed together so that they could feel the nipples of the mistress's rub against her own. The older woman's hot, broad hand sliding to the soft, bare flesh of Lucinda's upper leg, strong fingers clasping the underside of her buttocks, long enough to rest on her inner thigh. Sweat percolated, gathering and adhering their sheer clothes to them. When the dance ended, with the final pose, one of utmost intimacy, they appeared almost nude, Lucy sitting on the mistress's knee, almost grinding on it with powerful arms pulling her in tight, their breaths synchronized, the heat shared. All too soon, Lucy was released, and she found herself unsatisfied with her sudden freedom. The mistress composed herself, transforming instantly from a being on fire to one of ice. It seems you are adequate enough in the steps. Her tone was curt.
Did I not please you?
Lucy simpered, desperate for her praise. What would please me is for you to obey. She placed her hand on Lucy's sternum, then pushed. The sudden motion caused her to fall. She shrieked, falling to the ground.
Mistress, why?
You will not disobey me again.
That's not...
My commands are just as good. She stood over Lucy, one foot on each side of her hips, as that little fool who seeks to court you.
Mistress, please, you do not understand.
Be good for me, Lucinda, and I can be good to you. Her hot palm reached for Lucy again.
No, I try, but I'll never be good enough.
Lucy screamed, lurching away from the woman. Stop! Stop, you infernal woman! Her husband shakes her awake, his two hands vices against the velvet of her shoulders. Not even an hour away, and I find you howling at the stage like a child. Lucinda, the madam, blinked away the last bit of her confusion.
Darling,
Enough! His command rang loudly and clearly through the abandoned room. For a moment, she could almost hear a feminine voice layered atop of his. I came to tell you it's over. Negotiations were successful.
You mean it's true? The theater's ours?
She gasped in delight, and with much struggling brought herself to her feet.
Oh dear, what wonderful news! I can't wait until we fix up this old place. We'll have such fun together, just like we used to.
Lucinda.
Oh, we were so happy. You came to see me perform. I never felt more alive than when I got to perform for you. And how you couldn't keep your hands off of me.
Lucinda.
Can you imagine the silly little ballerina owning all of this? And now together...
Alone! Her husband cut her off. Lucinda, this is not ours, but yours alone.
What? But I don't understand.
That was the agreement, right? I buy you this stupid building, and you move out of the house without a fuss.
You were just joking. You will live with I.
There are apartments left behind by your old mistress. I am sure you will find yourself more than comfortable, he said with scorn.
But I love you and you love me.
I have not loved you for a long time, and I doubt you love me ever.
That's not true. We can love again. Like we can make this place good again.
You can fix up this decrepit space all you like, but it will never be what it once was, just as you will never be as you once were.
Why are you saying such cruel things?
We have both been unhappy. I am just tired of having to bother with only your unhappiness all the time. Move your things out of the main house by the end of the next week. Matilda arrives at the end of the month.
So that's it. That's what all this is. You cheat and you think you will make it okay.
You agreed to these terms. I told you to stop dancing after we were married, but you continued until you broke yourself. Now I can't even hold you without you crying. What good is a wife that a husband cannot hold? I told you I didn't love you anymore, and instead of asking me why you bartered and traded my affection for a condemned building.
Is there anything I can do to make us better?
Move out by the end of next week. I will have a small allowance made out to you until you get under your feet again, or your feet again.
Darling, darling!
Lucinda screamed, crumbling against center stage, home but not, absent of the people who would have made it so. She had made her final destination, but without the Sterns and Starlight to safely get her there. Her grief a dramatic play for the invisible audience, one final show of her season before the last of the house lights burnt out. Thank you. That was all we're going to read today. I won't torture you more. So, okay, don't be too glad I'm not reading more. Calm down. I still have something to say, people. Something to say. So this was actually directly inspired because when I had the pleasure of going to Douglas Anderson, we read a lot of Doll's House, a lot of stories about men and women. Usually the women threw themselves into the ocean and died, as they should, I guess. And so when this was being composed, a lot of that inspiration would be found here. And so the whole theme of the book is that there is a light in the dark. So usually it goes from one story has a little bit of hope, from a man welcoming his daughter into the world for the first time, to unfortunately a young lady throwing herself away after a man who will not return her affections. The whole theme of Dead Last Price Books to Die For is to deal with the cruel reality of bereavement and loss and a little bit of that darkness. I think it makes it accessible for people. I learned this fact because when I, as a teacher of 10 years now, I looked at my students and unfortunately had the misfortune of dealing with the loss of a student. And there is nothing more striking than walking into a space where a student is no longer and having to deal with all of the grief of all the children around you. Because what we do not do as a society is tell people how to deal with that grief. You must be strong. They're in a better place, but the better place is with you. That you just be happy that they're no longer suffering. But happiness is hard to ascertain when you are in grief. And grief is beautiful, and it is not scary. I've never had a child cry over my makeup because they understand the truth as much as I, that sometimes to say goodbye means that I get to say hello sooner than later to you. Thank you and have a good day.